The alarm clock rang at 5:45 in the morning. Wendy Newman opened her eyes in the darkness of a small apartment in Beacon Hill, a historic neighborhood in Boston where history still lived in every cobblestone alley. The cold October air seeped through the drafty window. She was 28 years old, a single mother, and exactly 2 months into her new job at King & Son Construction. She rose quietly so she would not wake Zoe, her 7-year-old daughter, who was sleeping in the second room, under a quilt decorated with pink stars. Wendy looked at her daughter's small face, seeing the same dark hair as her own, but with lighter eyes, full of a childlike trust that always squeezed her heart tightly. 7 years ago, Zoe's father vanished the moment he found out about the pregnancy. He simply walked out and never returned, leaving behind no message, no money, and absolutely no explanation. The kitchen was tiny, barely fitting a table, a stove, and a refrigerator. Wendy boiled water for tea, sliced some wheat bread, and spread it with butter and strawberry jam. Breakfast was always simple, because the money simply did not stretch for anything more. The job at King & Son was a true blessing after 6 months of terrifying unemployment. Being an archive assistant was not glamorous, but it was stable enough to pay the rent and finally buy Zoe proper boots for the harsh New England winter. She woke her daughter at 6:30 in the morning. Zoe rubbed her eyes, yawned loudly, and smiled sleepily, a smile that always gave Wendy the immense strength needed for another grueling day. They ate together at the small table, their knees touching in the cramped space. Zoe talked excitedly about elementary school and her best friend Maya, who had just gotten a brand new unicorn backpack. Wendy listened carefully, nodding and hoping that maybe in 2 months she would be able to buy Zoe something similar for the holidays. At 7:25, they stepped out onto the narrow, winding streets of Boston, full of expensive cafes that Wendy could never afford to visit on her strict budget. She walked Zoe to the red brick building of elementary school number 45, kissing her daughter gently on the forehead at the main gate. Zoe waved happily and ran toward her classmates, while Wendy hurried toward the subway station. The Green Line took her straight to the financial district every day, where the elegant King & Son corporate skyscraper stood tall as one of the largest construction firms in Massachusetts. She waited for the train, constantly checking her watch. Work started precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning, and she thought she would just make it. The train arrived at 7:40, and Wendy found a seat by the window as the bustling city slowly woke up around her. Wendy watched the passing streets, her mind entirely focused on the tasks for the day, and her direct manager, Thomas Green. The 50-year-old man had sharp facial features and an even sharper tone of voice. He treated her with barely concealed contempt, ever since he discovered she was a single mother, always finding a petty excuse for criticism. Last week, she was 10 minutes late, because Zoe had a sudden fever, and Wendy had to take her to their kind neighbor, Barbara. Green refused to accept the explanation, and a formal warning was placed in her file. The week before that, a subway delay made her 8 minutes late, resulting in another warning. Wendy knew the corporate policy was ruthless. A third strike meant instant termination. Suddenly, the subway train halted with a terrible screech. The engine whined alarmingly, and the conductor announced a significant mechanical delay. The passengers groaned in frustration, but Wendy felt her blood run entirely cold. She looked at her watch. It was 7:55. Her heart began to beat furiously against her ribs. She rushed off the train with a crowd of others, and began to run through Boston Common. The large park stretched around the downtown area, its autumn trees blazing with yellow, red, and brown leaves. But as Wendy sprinted through the maze of paths, she paid absolutely no attention to the beauty. The leaves were dangerously wet from the night's drizzle. A thin layer of frost had settled on the cobblestones, and the biting wind cut sharply across her face. She checked her phone frantically. It was 8 o'clock and 7 minutes. She was already late, and the office was still 10 minutes away. Green was surely waiting by her desk, holding the termination paperwork. This was the end. She was going to lose her job, and panic set in about how she would pay for the apartment or feed Zoe. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him, A man was lying motionless on the wet stones near a wooden park bench. His briefcase was overturned, a laptop spilled out, and important papers were scattered around him like white leaves. His gray suit was clearly expensive and tailored, paired with a light shirt and a dark blue tie. The man stirred slightly, attempting to sit up, but swayed dangerously. Blood poured from a deep cut on his forehead, streaming down his pale cheek and dripping onto his pristine collar. Dozens of people walked past him, businessmen with briefcases and students with backpacks, all with their heads bowed down, intensely focused on their phones and their own busy lives. Nobody stopped, and nobody even slowed their pace. Wendy paused, checking her watch at 8:10, then looked at the bleeding man. The voice of her grandmother Josephine, who raised her after her parents passed away, rang out clearly in her mind. A person should never be a wolf to another person. Wendy approached and crouched quietly beside the injured man. Up close, she realized he was younger than she initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair lightly dusted with morning frost, and blue eyes currently clouded with immense pain and disorientation. The gash on his forehead looked terrible. She spoke softly, telling him he had slipped on the ice, as she reached into her worn purse for a packet of tissues. She took several out and pressed them gently against his head to stem the bleeding. The man looked at her, struggling to focus his vision, and whispered a raspy thank you, noting that everyone else had simply walked right past him. Wendy began to quickly gather his scattered belongings. The laptop was damp but seemingly undamaged, while the building plans and contracts were soaked through. She placed everything neatly back into his leather briefcase, pulled out her phone, and called for a taxi to their exact location in the park. The cab arrived in 8 minutes. Wendy helped the tall man to his feet, supporting his heavy weight under his arm, while the driver looked at them suspiciously before finally opening the door. She guided him into the back seat and asked where he needed to go. He weakly requested a private clinic on Newbury Street, so Wendy relayed the address to the driver. The man looked at her with exhausted eyes and asked for her name. She told him she was Wendy Newman. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the seat, and murmured that his name was James King. The name did not register as significant to her. Boston had plenty of people named King. She closed the taxi door and watched the yellow car drive away into the morning traffic. Only then did she look down at her watch again. It was 8:47. She was exactly 47 minutes late for work. She started to run again, pushing her tired legs as fast as they could go, but deep down, she already knew that her fate was entirely sealed. The King & Son building stood on State Street like a massive, gleaming glass tower, completely different from the historic brick structures surrounding it. Wendy burst through the heavy revolving doors at 9:23, completely breathless. Her wet hair clung to her face, and her cheap coat was soaked from running through the rain and melting snow. The receptionist, a young woman with flawless makeup, glared at her with obvious disapproval. The elevator carried Wendy to the 3rd floor in an agonizing, painful silence. The polished metal doors reflected her disheveled appearance. Her cheeks were bright red from exertion, her breathing was heavy, and her clothes were a mess. There was absolutely nothing she could do. The elevator doors opened to the vast open space of the 3rd floor, where 30 desks were arranged in neat, perfectly aligned rows. Several people looked up from their computer screens as Wendy stepped onto the floor. In their eyes, she saw a mixture of pity and quiet relief that the impending punishment was not falling upon them. Thomas Green stood directly beside her desk. His gray hair was slicked back, his metal-rimmed glasses gleamed in the fluorescent light, and he held a standard white corporate envelope with the company logo in the corner. Wendy recognized it instantly as a termination notice. Green stated her name in a voice completely devoid of any human emotion, noting her 47 minutes of tardiness. Wendy opened her mouth, desperately trying to explain the broken subway, the bleeding man on the ice, the blood, and how absolutely no one else would stop to help. But Green raised his hand, silencing her with a sharp, dismissive gesture. He loudly declared that he did not want to hear any more pathetic excuses. He mocked her story about saving someone on the street, demanding that she be serious. Several co-workers at neighboring desks quickly averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their work. Evelyn from accounting stared blankly at her monitor, while Paul from the legal department held a silent telephone to his ear just to avoid looking at the unfolding tragedy. Green stepped closer, his voice echoing in the quiet office, stating that King & Son was a prestigious firm with high standards, and that clients paid for professionalism, not for fairy tales about sick children and imaginary street rescues. Wendy whispered that it was the absolute truth, and that she really did help a man, feeling a painful lump forming in her throat. Green snapped that he had heard enough. He shoved the white envelope into her trembling hands, announcing her immediate termination. He ordered her to pack her personal belongings and vacate the premises within 1 hour, adding that Human Resources would mail her final documents. The envelope felt as heavy as a stone block. Green cruelly added that if it had been entirely up to him, he would have fired her the very first time she was late, complaining that single mothers always bring unnecessary drama to the workplace. Wendy felt hot tears welling up in her eyes, but she clenched her jaw fiercely. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry in front of everyone. She opened her desk drawer and began placing her few items into her bag: a notebook, some pens, a coffee mug, and the framed photograph of Zoe. She packed the picture with the utmost care, wrapping it gently in a tissue. She zipped her bag shut, carrying the remnants of her dignity toward the elevators. Wendy pressed the illuminated button for the elevator and watched the numbers slowly count down from the upper floors. 3rd floor, 2nd, 1st, ground. The gentle chime sounded. The polished metal doors began to slide open, and Wendy suddenly heard fast, incredibly confident footsteps stepping out. She turned her head and gasped. Walking out of the elevator was the exact same man in the gray suit she had saved in the park over an hour ago. He was standing perfectly straight now, though a thick white medical bandage was professionally taped to his forehead. His clothes were still slightly damp, and his dark hair was somewhat unkempt, but it was not his appearance that made Wendy freeze. It was the immediate reaction of the entire corporate office. Everyone stood up simultaneously, as if pulled by an invisible string. Evelyn, Paul, Justine, and all the others snapped to attention at their desks, standing rigid and alert. Even Thomas Green froze completely, his smug face suddenly turning as pale as a ghost. The man, James King, walked slowly and deliberately across the open floor. His sharp blue eyes scanned the large room until they landed directly on Wendy, focusing on the white envelope clutched in her hand and the heavy bag slung over her tired shoulder. He spoke softly, but his deep voice carried through the absolute silence like rolling thunder, calling her the woman who saved him. In a dizzying rush of realization, Wendy finally understood. He was not just some random businessman named King. He was James King, the multi-millionaire owner and president of the entire construction empire. He was her ultimate boss. James stepped closer, each of his footfalls echoing loudly in the perfectly quiet room. Wendy stood completely motionless, her mind struggling to process the surreal situation. Thomas Green suddenly stammered, his arrogant confidence entirely shattered, stuttering that they had absolutely no idea Mr. King was visiting the Boston branch today. James did not even glance in the manager's direction. His intense gaze remained entirely fixed on Wendy's exhausted, pale face. James told her simply that he had been searching for her. He explained that he had lost her business card in the taxi, but the driver remembered dropping her off at this specific address on State Street. Since it was the only building on the block housing his company's employees, he knew she had to be here. Wendy opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to produce any sound. James looked down at the white envelope trembling in her hand and asked quietly what she was holding. Finding her voice, Wendy whispered that it was her termination notice, explaining that she was 47 minutes late, which constituted her 3rd strike under the firm's strict attendance policy. James gently took the envelope from her fingers, opened it, and swiftly read the printed page. His jaw clenched tight with visible anger. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Green with an icy, terrifying intensity. He ordered Green to step forward immediately. The manager approached stiffly, his legs practically shaking, as beads of nervous sweat formed on his forehead. James asked him, his voice laced with steel, to explain exactly why he was firing an employee who had just saved the life of the company's owner. Green swallowed hard, making weak excuses that he thought the rescue story was a lie and that the rulebook strictly mandated termination for a third tardiness, without any exceptions. James asked Green if he had ever bothered to read the company rulebook in its entirety. When Green weakly nodded, James reminded him of paragraph 17, which explicitly stated that lateness caused by extreme emergencies, such as saving a human life, was entirely exempt from disciplinary action and required board review. Green stammered that technically it was true, but James cut him off sharply. He declared that Wendy had saved his life from severe hypothermia and a concussion while he was bleeding on the freezing cobblestones. He furiously reprimanded Green for firing a loyal worker without even checking the facts or making a single phone call to verify her tragic story. The silence in the office was so thick that Wendy could clearly hear the rapid beating of her own heart. Everyone watched the incredible scene unfold like a dramatic theater play. James calmly folded the termination letter in half, then again and again, until he let the tiny white pieces flutter down to the carpet like falling snow. He looked at Wendy and declared in a booming voice that the firing was entirely void. Furthermore, he announced that as of this exact moment, Wendy Newman was his personal executive assistant. She would work on the 4th floor, receive a salary 3 times higher, and have fully flexible hours so she could properly care for her young daughter. Wendy felt the room spin wildly around her. She whispered that she did not understand why he was doing this. James turned to the entire floor and explained that while dozens of well-dressed people ignored a bleeding man to rush to their meetings, Wendy risked her livelihood and used her own tissues to save him. He stated that her actions revealed more genuine character than any corporate resume ever could. He thanked her deeply, then turned to Green, instantly demoting the cruel manager to a cold warehouse in Worcester to count inventory. James asked Wendy to follow him to the executive suites, leaving the stunned 3rd floor erupting into furious whispers the moment the elevator doors finally closed. The 4th floor looked completely different from the crowded open space below. It featured incredibly spacious offices with heavy mahogany doors, thick premium carpets that silenced footsteps, and massive glass walls. Gorgeous framed photographs of the company's greatest architectural achievements decorated the hallways. Towering skyscrapers in New York, luxury residential complexes in Chicago, and modern shopping centers in Miami. The air smelled rich, carrying the scent of expensive coffee and genuine leather furniture. James led Wendy down the long corridor, walking past heavy doors marked for the chief financial officer and the director of legal affairs. At the very end of the hall, there were 2 doors, one massive door labeled President and a slightly smaller one right beside it. James opened the smaller door and gestured for her to enter. The room was beautiful and elegant, boasting a large desk crafted from light wood, situated directly under a massive window overlooking Boston Common. Ironically, she could see the exact paved pathway where she had saved his life, just hours before. The office included a comfortable ergonomic chair, a high-end computer, and a small leather sofa against the wall. James stood in the doorway, explaining that she would be working directly with him, coordinating high-level meetings, and managing communications with international contractors. He firmly reiterated that she should never worry about her hours, promising that her schedule would revolve entirely around her daughter's needs. Wendy placed her worn bag gently on the beautiful desk, still struggling to believe that any of this was real. Less than an hour ago, she was a terrified, unemployed mother, and now she possessed an executive office on the highest floor. She looked at James and quietly asked why he was going to such incredible lengths for her, admitting that while she understood gratitude, this extreme generosity felt like too much. James stepped fully into the room, walking over to the large window to stare down at the tiny figures strolling through the autumn trees. He stood with his back to her, taking a deep, shuddering breath before he finally began to speak. 4 years ago, James began, his voice heavy with sorrow, He lost his beloved wife and his beautiful children in a horrific car accident. They were driving on the highway during a terrible winter blizzard when a commercial truck lost control and swerved into their lane. His wife, Natalie, died instantly on impact. His precious 6-year-old twins, Michael and Anna, passed away in the ambulance on the way to the emergency room. Wendy felt a painful, suffocating tightness grip her throat as she listened. James explained that ever since that awful night, he had become a ghost. He stopped living and merely existed for his construction company, burying himself entirely in architectural blueprints, endless financial spreadsheets, and aggressive contract negotiations. He turned around slowly to face Wendy, his blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He confessed that when he slipped and fell on the ice that morning, bleeding and in terrible pain, a dark part of his mind wished he would just freeze to death so he could finally be reunited with his family. He watched the businessmen step over him and felt completely invisible, as if he had already faded from the world. But then Wendy stopped. She knelt down, stained her hands with his blood, and showed him genuine compassion. Her simple, selfless act pierced through 4 years of absolute darkness, making him realize that he was still a human being and a life worth saving. The profound silence that followed filled the elegant office. Wendy finally spoke, her voice a soft, trembling whisper, telling him about her own daughter, Zoe. She shared the painful story of how Zoe's father abandoned them upon learning of the pregnancy, leaving her to face the harsh world completely alone. She confessed that she deeply understood what it meant to feel invisible, citing the judgmental stares on the subway and the cruel whispers from people like Thomas Green. She told James she stopped to help him because she knew the agonizing pain of desperately needing help and receiving nothing. She refused to let another human being feel the crushing isolation she had endured for 7 long years. James listened with unwavering attention, his expression softening with profound empathy. The expensive telephone on his desk suddenly rang, breaking the heavy emotional tension. He answered it quickly, confirming the postponement of a major investor meeting, and hung up. He looked at Wendy and insisted that she call him James, assuring her that he did not want her to feel trapped by gratitude. He told her to go home immediately, giving her the rest of the day off with full pay so she could pick up Zoe early and spend quality time with her child. He promised that if the job ever became too difficult, she only had to say the word, because he considered himself forever in her debt. Wendy sat down in the plush leather chair after he quietly left the room. She stared out the window at the distant pathways of the park, realizing her life had completely changed in a single hour. She pulled out her phone and texted her neighbor Barbara, happily announcing that she would be picking Zoe up from school herself. For the first time in many months, she would be standing at the school gates before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A genuine, radiant smile spread across her tired face. She realized that perhaps the universe was not entirely cruel. Sometimes, immense goodness returns to those who give it freely, and this miraculous day was only the very beginning. The first 2 weeks in her new executive role passed like a wonderful, surreal dream. Every morning, Wendy woke up half expecting someone to call and announce that a massive mistake had been made. But the phone never rang with bad news. The elegant office on the 4th floor was always waiting for her. James treated her with a level of profound respect and genuine kindness she had never experienced in her entire professional life. She quickly discovered that managing the daily affairs of a millionaire CEO involved navigating incredibly complex relationships, multi-million-dollar urban development projects, and intense negotiations with high-powered investors from across the globe. Yet, underneath James's brilliant, calculated business facade, Wendy clearly saw his lingering, profound loneliness. He worked from the early hours of dawn until late into the night, often eating cold, tasteless sandwiches alone at his desk. He had absolutely no friends calling to invite him out, and his office was entirely devoid of personal items, except for one hidden photograph Wendy accidentally saw while organizing his files. It showed a younger, happier James with a dark-haired woman and 2 smiling children on a sunny beach. Wendy never mentioned the heartbreaking picture, understanding that some wounds were simply too deep for casual conversation. Instead, she focused fiercely on her work, bringing meticulous order to his chaotic schedule. She proved her immense value to the firm, silencing the petty gossip from the lower floors through sheer competence. The incredibly flexible hours allowed Wendy to be a present mother for the first time in Zoe's life. She could finally take her daughter to the playground, bake sweet chocolate cookies on Friday afternoons, and read long fairy tales at bedtime without constantly checking the clock in panic. Zoe noticed the beautiful change immediately, wrapping her small arms around Wendy's neck one evening and telling her mother how much happier she looked. When Zoe asked about the new boss who made this possible, Wendy smiled softly and described him as a very good but very sad man. November arrived, bringing the first major crisis when the lead graphic designer collapsed with appendicitis right before a crucial presentation. It was Thursday evening, and James was pacing his office in sheer panic. The presentation for a massive $120 million residential project in Seattle was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning, and half the digital slides were an absolute mess. Knowing the incredible stakes, Wendy firmly volunteered to stay overnight and fix the critical presentation. James protested, but Wendy was determined. She called Barbara to ask if Zoe could sleep over, explaining to her disappointed but understanding daughter that she needed to help the sad man. Wendy and James worked tirelessly until 3 o'clock in the morning, drinking bitter coffee from the break room as they meticulously built 47 flawless, compelling slides from scratch. Exhausted but triumphant, Wendy leaned back in her chair. James looked at the finished screen, then turned his gaze to her, quietly stating that she had saved his life for a second time. Wendy brushed it off as mere loyalty, but James insisted that such fierce dedication was incredibly rare. As they sat in the quiet, sleeping city, James asked her why she was so intensely loyal. Wendy repeated the truth she lived by. She knew the pain of putting her heart into something only to watch it fall apart alone. James smiled softly, noting that his late wife, Natalie, shared that exact same boundless empathy, always believing that profound kindness was never a weakness. The presentation to the investors was an overwhelming success, securing the massive contract by Monday afternoon. James publicly praised Wendy's extraordinary efforts in front of the entire board of directors. As December covered the city of Boston in a thick, glittering blanket of white snow, James began to change. He smiled much more often, started eating his lunches in the sunny cafeteria, and actually left the corporate building before 9 o'clock at night. One cold morning, he surprised Wendy by bringing a beautifully wrapped bead-making kit for Zoe, mentioning that his sister had recommended it for young girls. Wendy was deeply touched, realizing that James was slowly, bravely allowing his frozen heart to thaw. The peaceful routine was violently shattered a few days later, when Wendy's phone rang with an emergency call from the elementary school. Zoe had fainted during physical education and was running a dangerous fever. James did not hesitate for a single second. He grabbed his keys and drove Wendy through the snowy streets in his black luxury car, reaching the school in exactly 12 minutes. Inside the nurse's office, James saw Zoe lying pale and sweating on a small cot. The sight of the little girl, with her blonde braids and flushed cheeks, struck his heart like lightning, painfully reminding him of his lost daughter, Anna. Yet, instead of running from the immense pain, he knelt beside the bed. He spoke to Zoe with incredible gentleness, promising her that she would feel better soon. He drove them back to Wendy's modest apartment and helped carry the sick child up 2 flights of stairs. As Wendy frantically called the local pediatrician to book an appointment, she returned to find James sitting quietly by Zoe's bed, watching her sleep. He confessed to Wendy that looking at Zoe was the first time in 4 years he felt hope instead of just blinding agony. He admitted that his feelings for Wendy went far beyond professional gratitude. But before Wendy could fully respond to his heartfelt confession, her cell phone rang with an unknown number. It was Peter Zane, Zoe's father. The voice on the other end of the line made Wendy's blood run completely cold. Peter Zane casually announced his return to Massachusetts, demanding to meet the daughter he had abandoned 7 long years ago. He spoke with sickening entitlement, claiming he had reformed his life, secured a stable job, and hired a lawyer to pursue partial custody rights. Wendy's hands shook with a violent mixture of pure rage and sheer terror. She screamed into the phone about the years of crying alone in the dark, working double shifts, and struggling to buy food, while he contributed absolutely nothing. Peter coldly threatened legal action and demanded a meeting the following day at 12 o'clock in Harvard Square. Wendy dropped the phone, collapsing onto the nearest chair as hot tears streamed down her face. She sobbed that Peter was going to use his lawyers to take her only child away. James immediately wrapped his strong arms around her trembling shoulders, holding her incredibly tight. He swore fiercely that he would never let that happen. When Wendy cried that she had no money for a legal defense, James looked deep into her eyes and promised to unleash the most ruthless, powerful corporate lawyers in the entire state to protect her family. He told her she was no longer fighting alone, kissing her forehead gently and declaring that it was finally his turn to save her. The next day, precisely at 12 o'clock, Wendy sat at a historic wood-paneled cafe near the university. James sat firmly by her right side, and Adrian Wood, the brilliant and terrifying chief legal counsel for King & Son, sat to her left. Peter walked in 15 minutes late, wearing a trendy, expensive coat and a smug smile, clearly expecting to easily intimidate his former girlfriend. His arrogant smile vanished instantly when he saw the 2 powerful men flanking her. Adrian Wood wasted absolutely no time. He opened a thick leather folder and coldly presented a devastating, fully documented investigation into Peter's current life, proving he was nothing more than a mid-level salesman drowning in personal debt. Adrian brutally exposed Peter's true, greedy motives. He handed over printed transcripts from recent internet forums where Peter had explicitly asked how to extort child support from an ex-girlfriend who was dating a wealthy millionaire. The color drained completely from Peter's face. James leaned across the wooden table, his blue eyes burning with an incredibly dark, protective fury. He warned Peter in a dangerously quiet voice that if he ever approached Wendy or Zoe again, James would use his immense fortune to utterly destroy his life. Adrian then presented the ultimate ultimatum. Peter owed over $150,000 in retroactive child support, a sum that would guarantee his financial ruin. Adrian slid a legal document across the table. He calmly explained that if Peter signed away all of his parental rights permanently, Wendy would graciously waive the massive financial debt he owed. Cornered, terrified, and completely outmatched, Peter grabbed the pen with trembling fingers and signed the heavy documents without reading another word. He stood up, muttered a pathetic apology, and practically ran out of the busy cafe, disappearing from their lives forever. Wendy broke down in tears of profound relief. James held her close, whispering that the nightmare was finally over. When Adrian discreetly left them alone, Wendy asked James why he did all of this. He simply replied that he could no longer live without her. By December, the festive holiday spirit had completely transformed the snowy city. James spent every single weekend with Wendy and Zoe, walking through the brightly lit parks and treating Zoe to hot chocolate and gingerbread. Zoe blossomed under his warm attention, eventually asking if she could call him Dad. When James heard those precious words, he wept openly, wrapping his arms around the little girl and promising to be the best father in the world. A few days later, James's mother, Helen King, called from Cape Cod. She had heard about the amazing woman who saved her son and joyfully demanded that James bring his new family to their coastal home for the upcoming holidays. On the 24th of December, they drove out to the beautiful historic house near the freezing ocean. Helen and James's sister Madeline stood on the snowy porch, welcoming them with tight hugs and tears of immense gratitude. Helen fell to her knees to hug Zoe, thanking the little girl for bringing the light back into their family. The large dining table was elegantly set with 12 traditional dishes and filled with incredible warmth and loud laughter. During the evening, Helen pulled Wendy aside expressing her profound joy that her son was truly alive again. That night, sitting quietly by a crackling fireplace, James looked at Wendy and realized their broken pieces had somehow built a perfect life. The new year brought a beautiful, entirely fresh start for everyone. James was visibly transformed within the corporate office, laughing openly during board meetings and leading his massive company with renewed, vibrant passion. Wendy thrived in her demanding executive role, seamlessly balancing her high-level professional duties with her joyful family life. In late February, as the harsh winter began to finally melt away, James took Wendy to his incredibly spacious penthouse overlooking the Charles River. He gently held both of her hands and asked her and Zoe to move in permanently. After 4 agonizing years of living in the dark, he declared he was completely finished with fear, wanting to share every waking moment with the woman he loved. Wendy hesitated briefly, terrified that this incredible dream might suddenly vanish, but James reassured her with unyielding devotion. By April, the apartment was filled with Zoe's joyous laughter as she ran down the wide hallways, deeply thrilled to finally have a huge room of her own. In May, Wendy sat on the edge of the bathroom tub, staring in absolute shock at a positive pregnancy test. Her heart raced with wild anxiety about how James would react to having a new baby after losing his first children. That evening, she bravely gathered her courage and shared the news. James froze completely, the air leaving his lungs, before he dropped heavily to his knees in front of her. Tears of profound, overwhelming joy streamed down his face as he pressed his ear to her stomach. He wept loudly, exclaiming that his late wife Natalie would be incredibly happy that he was building a family again. In June, under a spectacular sunset, painting the Boston sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, James took Wendy for a walk across a beautiful stone bridge. He stopped, pulled out a small velvet box, and presented a breathtaking ring made of rare Baltic amber set in pure white gold. He told her she was the dividing line between his past sorrow and his future joy, and asked her to marry him. Wendy cried and said yes 1,000 times. They were married in July in a small, incredibly intimate ceremony inside a historic downtown church. Zoe wore a beautiful white dress, proudly serving as the happiest flower girl in the world. Helen and Madeline wept with joy in the front row. During a routine medical ultrasound in late October, the doctor smiled brightly and pointed to 2 distinct shapes on the glowing monitor. Wendy and James stared in utter disbelief as the doctor cheerfully announced they were expecting twin girls. The news hit James like a massive tidal wave. He gripped the edge of the chair, his face turning incredibly pale as the powerful echoes of his lost twins crashed into his mind. Wendy tightly grabbed his trembling hand, whispering that this was not a cruel joke of fate, but a beautiful, miraculous sign from his children in heaven, telling him that everything was finally going to be completely fine. James broke down in the doctor's office, crying freely as he accepted this incredible second chapter of his life. 3 years later, a warm spring breeze swept across the sandy beaches of Cape Cod. The bright blue ocean sparkled brilliantly under the clear sky. Wendy sat comfortably on a large woven blanket, her heart overflowing with absolute peace as she watched her beautiful 10-year-old daughter, Zoe, building a magnificent sandcastle near the gentle, rolling waves. Running clumsily toward the water were 3-year-old Natalie and Anna, wearing identical bright blue dresses and giggling wildly. James chased closely behind them, his face tanned and completely radiant with pure, unfiltered happiness. Helen sat quietly next to Wendy, wiping away a tear as she marveled at the miraculous resurrection of her son's spirit. James scooped both toddlers into his strong arms, carrying them back to the blanket while they squealed with absolute delight. He sat down heavily in the warm sand next to his wife, placing his arm around her shoulders. He looked deep into her eyes, his expression filled with a love so profound it practically took her breath away. James whispered softly over the sound of the ocean that falling on that freezing ice was the greatest, most important moment of his entire existence. Wendy leaned her head against his shoulder, smiling as she watched their 3 beautiful daughters playing happily in the afternoon sun. She knew that sometimes people have to fall so that someone else can bravely stop to pick them up. As the golden sun began to slowly set over the vast Atlantic water, casting long shadows across the peaceful beach, they held hands in perfect, tranquil silence. They were a family forged from terrible pain, healed by boundless compassion, and bound together by an enduring, extraordinary love. Looking back on the twists and turns of their remarkable journey, one comes to realize a profound truth about the human condition. In a world that constantly rushes forward, where everyone is hurried by the ticking clock and the heavy burdens of their own lives, true grace is found in the simple act of pausing. We often build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from the pain of loss and the harshness of betrayal, believing that isolation is our safest refuge. Yet, this story whispers a different wisdom to those who have walked many miles on the road of life. It reminds us that our greatest strength does not lie in our ability to keep walking when things get tough, but in our willingness to stop for someone else who has fallen. Compassion is the quiet force that weaves broken threads back into a beautiful tapestry. By extending a hand to a stranger in the freezing cold, we not only change their destiny, but we open the door to our own salvation. Life's most profound blessings are never found in perfect plans or strict schedules, but in those unexpected, fragile moments where we choose humanity over convenience.